Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Welcome to Professor Adam Boddison, my guest for today's Rethink Leadership podcast. Adam is the Chief Executive of the Association for Project Management, APM, the chartered membership body for the project profession. Throughout his work at APM, Adam spearheads initiatives aimed at advancing the project profession to the highest standards, ensuring it meets the evolving demands of a complex world. In this respect, Adam stands as a beacon of project excellence for organisations, boards, leaders and society at large. In this episode, Adam brings insights into the transformative power of project management, with the focus on building a case for leaders to cultivate greater projects capability and rigour, especially in execution terms, as this is, of course, where strategies can succeed or simply fizzle out. This episode is in aid of UNICEF, among the first organisations to respond to humanitarian crises, most recently in Gaza and Ukraine, where a child's right to happy, safe and healthy childhood is threatened. We have made a donation as a thank you to Adam for joining us. Adam, thanks very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself, your expertise, and what gets you up in the morning as the CEO of the Association for Project Management.
Hi, well, thank you for inviting me on. My name's Adam Boddison, as you say, CEO of the Association for Project Management. I've got a background in running professional bodies, membership associations. I always talk about being a leader of education and enterprise. It's really interesting. I think the commercial world and the education world don't always appear as two things that would go naturally together, but I think there's probably a missed opportunity there. And professional bodies are one of those types of organisation that I think do bring those together. But in terms of what makes me get up in the morning, every job I've ever done, and it includes my current role, which I've been in for about 3.5 years, every job I've ever done is all about what can I do that makes the world somehow a better place. I always think about that kind of societal benefit piece. I think about my own children and the kind of next generation. I think, are we going to leave this world in a better place than we've found it? And if you only have to switch on the news every day to see that we've got a lot of work to do in that space, there are some big challenges that we've got. And projects, I think about project management. Projects are a great vehicle for that. I think of something like, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They set out all of these ambitions of things that we've got to get right. Projects are one of the vehicles for kind of just delivering on that. So that's really what gives me my fire.
It's a great segue into our conversation. And I do get your point about that link between education and enterprise. And it has to get closer with the pace of change and the readiness for the workplace, misconceptions and expectations for the workplace as well, from both sides of it. And you're right, it's the professional bodies are sort of standing in that space at the moment. And you also embody one of modern leaders who is a force for good. And for us, with all that leaders are juggling at the moment, to be able to have that balance is something stronger, what others can learn from. So let me go into that project element, because we don't talk about this enough at leadership, at C-suite level, at even board level, in the same breath as saying, why are all our implementations failing? Well, perhaps it could be process, it could be about people, the culture that we're building in the organization. And we're in this huge current transformational landscape, whether it's digital workforce or leaders themselves. So let's go into your journey, because you've embodied this. So how has your project management and leadership expertise allowed you and your teams to tackle some of those challenges in successful and even new ways?
Yeah, I mean, you make a really important point around the kind of people versus processes versus culture side of things. And whilst project management has all of those things in it, it's not the obvious go-to thing for leaders, is it? I always think sometimes when I talk to, some of my colleagues who are CEOs of other organizations and so on, and if I start talking to them about project management, you can sometimes see the shutters come down. That's not what I do as a leader. It's almost somehow it's some kind of technical or administrative part of their organization. But if I was to have exactly the same conversation, and I've done this by the way, but I interchange the words project management for strategy execution, all of a sudden, all the shutters are open. Everybody's interested, right? We want to know why we can how we can get our strategies implemented perfectly, how we get the vision that's in our head or on our kind of plan to come to fruition in the best possible way to minimise the risks and deliver maximum value. Of course, every leader in the world wants that. So I think there is something around the image of the profession, the project management profession, and the kind of language that we use and the terminology that we use. But let's suppose we've got past all of that, and we've got our people in the C-suite to say, okay, we can see that there's something in this. What are the tangibles kind of in there? So I always talk about the kind of the three P's, P3M we call it. So project, program, and portfolio management. Project management's the one that's kind of probably most well known out there, because it's the kind of typical, we've got a piece of change or transformation that we want to deliver, and there's obviously a series of processes, everything from kind of risk management, business cases and assurance and so on, right through to quality management and benefits realization. That's probably the kind of more traditional project management. Your program management, I would say, is even more relevant to the C-suite, because this is where you've got multiple projects happening with probably interdependencies. So the classic I see at the moment in organizations is when, I don't know, maybe they're doing some kind of digital transformation, like they're putting in a new CRM system or something like that. And actually that's going to affect every part of their business. So other change programs are going to be affected by that. And what does that effective management of a group of projects look like? And what's the best way to do things? Right up to portfolio management, which I would say is more around prioritization. And targeting resources in those areas that are most likely to make a difference. As the board or as a C-suite of an organization, you can decide what order you do things in, where you put the resources, where you put the money, where you allocate your people, what the trade-offs are. But actually doing that in a really structured way that aligns to that kind of strategy execution piece, I think is really important. And if you take that into a public sector context, this is public money, taxpayers' money that's being spent on publicly funded projects, albeit delivered by the private sector, commissioned. You want to make sure that money's spent well, and this for me is where project management can come into its own.
This resonates with me hugely, because the leadership question of the day has shifted from what do we need to do to how do we execute successfully. We know that's where it fails. So having this rigor, you call it strategy execution rigor, let's call it, not or project management rigor, is very important. But then it's getting the right one in place. I like the three P's that you've given. What did you say? The three PM.
Yeah, P3M they call it in the sector, but it's basically project, program, and portfolio management.
So the P3M, the program management is something that resonates with me as a leader and somebody who works with leaders around digital transformation, because of all of those moving parts. And you need oversight on that. And that's where often it's failing, because you've got silos doing different work. It's not being pulled together. And the other point that you made around that prioritization is also something that I observe around budgets or resources being allocated to the wrong things because there isn't that rigor in place. But this takes competence and capability. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, Adam.
I'll go for it.
What are those skill sets and behaviors that are most associated with the very best and very senior project leaders? And what are the benefits of having that and seeing it run through successfully in execution terms?
Yeah. So interestingly, I would say that what makes a really effective project professional and what makes a really effective project leader, there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of some of the core kind of competencies and behaviors and so on. We have a saying in the project profession. We say projects don't go wrong; they start wrong. And if you think about who it is that starts projects, it is the leaders, isn't it? They're the ones who set out what the vision is and allocate the resource and the time for planning and so on. So I think there's a lot of transferability between what makes an effective project professional, an effective project leader. But to drill down into some of the specifics, I would say it's that people side of it which is going to be very important. To put that in context, if anyone who's listening to this, I would say think of any project that you've ever delivered. Could be a good one, could be a bad one, but think about what was the reason that it went exceptionally well or was a complete disaster. Was that to do with people or was it to do with processes? And my hunch is that most people listening to this are going to say, oh, there was a person or a group of people that was the determining factor which made it go, really well or not. And that's not to say, by the way, that process isn't important. And of course, you'd expect for project management, people often think it is all about process. Process is important. That's a foundational layer. But the people bit I actually think is even more important again. And some of those skills in there, I would say things like effective stakeholder engagement, communication management, I think is really important. We've all been in organizations where there's some change going on, but it's not quite been even if it's good change, if it's not been communicated well, it creates all kinds of chaos in organizations. And of course, things will sometimes not go to plan. So therefore, you need to be really good at conflict resolution as well. What happens when people have different ideas of what success looks like? How do you, as a leader, actually bring those people or different groups of people behind a kind of common vision, which might not be what either of those groups signed up for in the first place? That's a skill, and we will all know people who are good at that, and probably all know people who are less good at that as well. And so there's team management, leadership, and the final thing I think I would just really plug, and I can't emphasize this enough, is the kind of the ethical piece of this. We only have to look at what's going on in some parts of the world at the moment to see that there is a bit of a backlash against ethics and inclusion and things like this. I personally think delivering projects for the public good is really, really important. We have a strapline at APM, Association for Project Management. We say, when projects succeed, society benefits. And if we can't see that direct straight line from the effort that we're putting in to deliver a project to that societal benefits realization piece, then we start to think, actually, is this something we should be putting our expertise into?
Well, you just put something in my mind, and I've got to ask you the question. This is
go for
those outside of the UK. There's a big project that the last government put in place called HS1, which is a high-speed railway link up to the north, which has now been halted, stopped in part. Nobody really knows. With your project hat on, what's gone wrong there, Adam?
Well, it's a good question. So HS2.
Where to start?
HS2, one of our corporate partners, of course, we have about 500 corporate partners, one of which is HS2. In fact, lots of the publicly funded organizations are linked with us in some way. Now, it's a really interesting one. This is a classic example of where you have politics and projects mixing together, and it doesn't always end up that going as well as you might hope, because what happens is you get, for example, scope change. So for people who are not familiar with this language, when I talk about the scope, I'm talking about, what are the deliverables that we've contracted, if you like. So government says, we would like HS2 to be built, and this is what we want. And then they tender for that, and companies bid for the work, and then on they go. But of course, as we know from watching the news, different politicians come and go, different leaders come and go, different things happen locally. There are all kinds of different contextual changes that happen. And HS2 doesn't get built in a vacuum. It's built in this world of changing politics and dynamics and priorities. And what happens when someone says, actually, do you know what? We haven't got the money we thought we had at the beginning, or we've discovered some things now that we didn't know at the beginning. It's going to cost more than we thought. Do we take the view that we just plow on regardless because we started, we may as well finish? There are people that think that. Do we say, okay, we've got cut our cloth accordingly. We need to, maybe cut out some of the trimmings and we'll have a bit more of a kind of budget version of it. There are people who think that. There are other people who say, no, actually, we shouldn't be spending money that we can't afford. But what happens in a lot of political or publicly funded projects is that there is a view from those commissioning that if you reduce the scope, that projects will cost less. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. Sometimes there is a cost of change because, if let's be really blunt about this. If you've got a supplier who has set up their entire supply chain of equipment and materials and people and everything else, and you can't just turn that off. It's not like a tap. So even to stop that is difficult. And then, of course, because there's so much flip-flopping in terms of political will, then what you see in the supply chain is they don't have confidence that the work is coming, so they don't invest in the workforce. So you'll see some of the big suppliers who will say, well, I'm not going to get all my staff trained in the relevant qualifications so that when I win this contract, I'm ready to go on day one. I'll wait until I win the work first and see what exactly it is they want. And only then will I start. And so then you get this big delay, and delays also cost money. So a lot of it comes down to political flip-flopping, I would say, scope change, and uncertainty, which therefore means the necessary planning and investment at the front end of a project doesn't happen. And that's certainly true of HS2, and I would say it's true probably of a lot of publicly funded projects.
Yeah, but as you're speaking, I would have to say is that is recognizable in the corporate world now that we've got these macro strategies of digitally transforming our businesses, the workforce shift, new business models. These aren't small projects that we're dealing with anymore. And you get the same thing as you get this combination of project, the people, the processes, politics and scope creep and budget creep all coming into it there as well. Although it's more in the public eye in the public sector, I take it. But some of the costs of getting that wrong are really obvious. And you made the point, there are two very good points. First of all, it's not the projects that go wrong, it's that they start wrong. And that resonates. And we can also see, let's take HS2 for an example there then, the direct link with what you were talking about, that ethical side, about the impact on society. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, imagine a situation. So, we're going to build this railway, and this is not just HS2. It could be any railway, or it could be a road. It could be anything. We're going to build this, and then what happens is we discover it's going to have some huge ecological negative impact if we kind of continue with the plan. Something we could never possibly have known before. Do we say, well, actually, we've got budget targets to meet and we'll plow on, or do we come to some kind of arrangement? One of the big success stories of HS2, which I think is largely overshadowed by some of the problems that are well reported in the media, is the great work that it's actually done, not actually on the railway itself, but for many local environments. So I've been to visit many of the HS2 sites, and for example, I saw one where there was a local rowing club. Just to give you an example, it was complete. Their facilities were completely falling apart. The council didn't have enough money to support them. The local community really valued this, but HS2 was kind of going through their land, and in return for allowing that to happen, they built them this brand new state of the art rowing club with marina and all this brilliant stuff. Now, that's never going to form part of the kind of return on investment in terms of the business case, because probably it wasn't even known when the business case was written that was going to happen. But that's happening in communities up and down the country. And so there are these, I don't know, unknown about kind of benefits to these projects, which are largely overshadowed by the well-known media catastrophes, if we call them that we see in the papers and on the news.
Yeah, and that's true. And you don't see the upsides. I mean, specifically for something like this, which is a big infrastructure project, which is going over land. It's about environment, communities, all of these things. There are upsides and downsides, and you do see a lot of that good coming from it, the protection of certain species, the protection of certain communities, whatever it is. And it's probably more obvious there in the public sector, as you would see. Two sides of the same coin, I guess.
Well, they are. I mean, there are two. As we're talking, there's two projects in my mind that I think are worth reflecting on because both of them would be considered failures at the time that they happened, and both of them now, retrospectively, people would say, "Oh, yeah, we'd spend that money again." So one of them is the Sydney Opera House, right? The Sydney Opera House. In fact, the guy who I think designed it never went back to actually see it in it because they had to blow up the foundations originally because there was some mistakes on the foundations and so on. It cost a fortune, way, way, way over budget. And there was at the time it was it was late, it was over budget, it wasn't what was originally planned. But actually, if you look at the return on investment of the Sydney Opera House to Australia and the local community, just in terms of tourism alone, let alone anything else, over many years, with the benefits of hindsight, and you were back in that room day one making that decision, would you still go for it? 100% yes, absolutely. It's a landmark. It's a world landmark. And then the second one that's in my mind is the Channel Tunnel, linking England and France. Again, this was late, over budget. There were problems connecting it with the other side of the tunnel and so on. But the business case for the Channel Tunnel was all about moving people between England and France and other parts of Europe. But it now moves energy, for example, between England and France. That wasn't in the original business case. So there are these unintended benefits. And by the way, if I asked anybody on the street, what do you think of the Channel Tunnel? Is it a successful project? They'd probably say yes. So I think we have to be taking the long view sometimes about just because something's late or over budget, do we really deem that a failure? Sometimes we actually don't know until many, many years afterwards whether something was really a kind of failure or a success.
It's an interesting point that because that project rigor can uncover where new value can be created as you're going through it because you've got that rigor in place. You have very clever people, very invested people in it, and who knows, particularly with digital, of course, because there are so many unknowns there. So well, I do get that point. Yeah.
Well, let's think about digital, because digital moves so fast. Let's imagine you've got a digital project. Maybe it's a 12-month piece of work that you're doing, and you are religious. You absolutely deliver what's, all the outcomes that are expected. And after this 12-month period, you've delivered all of the outcomes absolutely to the required quality within the budget, within the time that was required. But because the world has moved on, because digital moves so fast, the outcomes that you've put in your project don't deliver any of the intended benefits. That can happen. They have a great expression for this in the Netherlands, by the way. It's a medical expression. I'm sure you've heard this before. The operation was successful. The patient is dead. In other words, we've delivered all of the outcomes, but none of the benefits. So again, it just opens this whole Pandora's box of what do we really mean by a successful strategy execution, a successful project delivery. It can't just be about time, cost, and quality. It must be about benefits, and benefits we can't really understand until much further into the future.
So with that in mind, there'll be many leaders tuning into this saying, right, I get this, the whole point about execution and execution rigor. Some of them will not be looking at it this way. So for those that haven't fully embraced the project leaders toolkit, let's call it, or the execution toolkit from a project lens, what would be your top 3 actionable strategies for them in navigating their own transformations, changes in the workplace, whatever it is?
Yeah, great question. First thing for me is, we've talked all the way through this conversation about the role of leadership, C-suite, and so on. I would be, if it was me, I'd be looking around my kind of colleagues on the leadership team and saying, where's our expertise in delivering transformation, change, project and program capability? And if we haven't got an obvious person, then we need somebody. Organizations now are starting to invest in, for example, the CPO, the Chief Project Officer type role, Chief Transformation Officer. Sometimes you see in organizations as well. I actually wonder, and this might be slightly controversial, but I'll say it anyway, I do wonder whether there is still a case for COO roles in organizations, because most companies I talk to, a lot of their time is spent delivering change rather than business as usual. And if that's the case, is the argument for a kind of chief transformation officer or a CPO type role much stronger now than a COO role? I say that might be a bit controversial, but I think that's certainly one thing I would say. Um, I think the second thing for me is around how do you integrate the kind of the BAU work with the transformation work. In some organizations, you have this distinction between, well, this is run the business, this is change the business. And if they never talk to each other, then often it's in the interplay between the two where you have some challenges. And so thinking about how we change that is important. And there are some lessons we can learn on that. If I think about marketing or technology, the digital space, actually, they've been on quite a journey. If you look over the last 20 years, they've both come from being almost backroom functions to being kind of strategic functions where they kind of serve both purposes. Both marketing and technology are delivering day-to-day BAU stuff, but they're also driving major change in organizations. And I think those two are professions where they've got that right. And so, when it comes to kind of delivering change more broadly, are the lessons we can learn from how that's structured in your organization. And then the third thing for me is around the kind of overall kind of strategic maturity around project delivery and change. There's plenty of maturity assessment frameworks out there. One of the things I particularly recommend, partly because it's an APM thing, is that we have a competence framework on the website. Now, it's aimed at individuals rather than organizations, but I've seen organizations where what they do is they say, let's just get everybody to complete this self-assessment, and it just gives us a snapshot over time against all of those core competencies. Where are we strong as an organization? And, is that at the, the junior levels of the organization, or is it at the more senior levels? What, is it in particular departments? And then on the basis of that, you can actually then start to put a plan in to increase your maturity and your capability and capacity to deliver change and deliver transformation over a period of time. And that seems to be a very common approach to me.
Thanks for that, Adam. That's really important to have those in place to start with, and a really great point for many of those who are tuning in that can grab hold of some of this and get to action. I've got one last question for you, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, because as you've been talking, we've referred to digital transformation, we've referred to new ways of working. So, for example, in my business and the businesses I work with, it's around adopting agile methodologies, and very human-centered and collaborative and iterative in our approach. Could you just help me understand if there indeed is a difference, the difference between agile project management and project management as I grew up with it?
Yeah. So I think when you say as you grew up with it, you probably mean waterfall type methods and more kind of, less iterative and more linear, I think is what you're getting at, right?
That's exactly right.
So when I talk about project management or project delivery, I'm talking about the full spectrum. So that includes the kind of more linear approaches, and it includes the more agile, small a agile approaches. And by the way, there's a whole load of hybrid methodologies as well. Critical chain methodology is another one that's come up, which is somewhere between that kind of linear and agile. There are lots of myths around this. For example, there are people who believe that you can never do a construction project in an agile way because you need to know what you're going to build before you get there. And equally, there are people who believe you can't do software development unless you do it in an agile way, and it must that you can't do it in a linear way. And of course, neither of those things are true. In my mind, the best project professionals are those who understand the different methodologies that are out there and can deploy the right methodology at the right time and are good at switching between the two when things change. We talked about HS2 earlier on. If you were to do something which was fully agile on that, you'd probably come unstuck pretty quickly because you'd get halfway up your railway line and you discover there's nowhere to go. But equally, if you had something that was so linear and you were saying, I know now what features I'm going to put into my station in 2035 when I don't even know what technology is going to exist now, well, clearly that's going to be problematic. So they have to draw on both different ends of that spectrum. For me, where there are problems is when you get the evangelists for particular methodologies who say this is the only way you can deliver something. It almost doesn't matter what that methodology is, you're probably onto a hide into nothing.
You're demonstrating agile mentality and mindset just by what you said there. Funnily enough, I had a conversation yesterday with my friend Linus, who spent a lot of time in China. I'm digressing hugely here. Spent time in China in the construction industry. And so much of it is about mindset and that getting away from 20th century thinking, if you want to think in more agile ways, into 21st century. He's telling me the 26 story block of flats that was built in, do you know how long? You heard it?
I don't know, but go on.
5 days.
Crikey.
So think about it, and it's agile based application of technology. It's building it in a factory. It's taking a non-traditional, non-linear approach, as you're talking about, to a very linear thinking traditional industry in parts of the world. Right. So that came immediately to mind from that point of view, and maybe that's happening in all industries and all disciplines like leadership. We just need to maybe think differently. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, as I said before, I don't think it's about evangelism around any particular approach, but the ability to shift and combine different methodologies is absolutely the way to go.
So thank you so much, Adam, for your time here. I'm sure many of those listening will want to continue the discussion, find out more about the Association for Project Management, and connect with you. How do they do all that?
Well, the obvious place is LinkedIn and TikTok. So APM and myself are on both of those. So you can find us pretty easily on there if you search for us. And of course, there's the APM website, which is apm.org.uk.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to take us through this whole conversation and this capability building opportunity for senior leaders, not just project professionals. Adam Boddison, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.